Let me begin by asking how many of you come from outside of the United States? Terrific. I've been coming up to Harvard now for basically the last 15 years, and I have to say that one of the real joys of being able to teach here, one of the reasons that I'm just immensely grateful year after year for the opportunity that Harvard has provided me, largely to teach reading courses, though on occasion seminars, is the opportunity to interact with people who are here for the LLM and JSD programs from abroad. The 1Ls, 2Ls, and 3Ls are also fine students, et cetera. But if, in fact, if one wants to point to the most important differentiation between the University of Texas, which is also a very good law school, and the Harvard Law School, it is the richness of the international programs. And what I at least see as the fullest realization of genuine diversity in educational programs, as against, I might say, somewhat snarkily, to the notion of diversity that is often articulated before the United States Supreme Court in the defense of programs that I support, but have precious little at the end of the day to do with any very robust notion of diversity. But it is the opportunity to teach courses of the kind that I'm teaching this year or in the past with students literally from all over the world that is just immensely helpful to me because I learned so much. Today, I hope that I can help inform you about one of the more mysterious features of the American political system, which is the Electoral College. And I want to frame my remarks within three overall notions. The first has to do with the general title of my talk. One hears a great deal about the notion of American exceptionalism. Most often, that is used by political figures across the political spectrum in praise of the United States, that we are the city on the hill, we are the beacon of freedom, or whatever it is, the world's last best hope. And we could obviously have an extended conversation about whether those notions of American exceptionalism have either ever been true or whether they are true today. There are other forms of American exceptionalism, though, that are true, which is drawn simply from looking at comparative political systems and realizing that there are several things we just do differently. One of them is the way we elect our presidents. Most of you, I suspect, simply as a statistical matter, are likely to come from non-presidential systems, that is, parliamentary systems, or perhaps quasi-presidential systems, as in most prominently France or Russia, which have become of some note. Though no doubt some of you do come from presidential systems, I'm quite confident that you don't elect your president the way we do. I'm not under oath when I say that the American system of electing its president is unique. There are, I think, 191 countries in the United Nations right now, somewhere around that, some portion of whom are presidentialists, and it may be that another one of the countries that, quite frankly, I'm ignorant of, uses an electoral college mechanism to select the president. But among what might be called major countries, countries that we tend to identify with as more or less democratic, etc., I do think that our system is unique. It is exceptional. I would also say there's nothing to commend it to anyone else, but it is important in understanding how American politics works. And that's one of the things that I want to address. A broader way of contextualizing my remarks. And this is a very, very strong theme of this particular book, Framed America's 51 Constitutions and the Crisis of Governance, is that if one looks at constitutions and tries to figure out what's really important about constitutions, I want to argue that we pay far, far too little attention to structures, and quite frankly, too much attention to rights. Since World War II, I think it's safe to say that constitutions have become, by and large, identified with their rights provisions. That's why NGOs immediately go all over the world when there are new people charged with drafting constitutions, because they wish to have place in those constitutions whatever their favorite rights might be. Do not get me wrong. I do not think that rights provisions are unimportant. I do think that the rights encapsulated in the so-called American Bill of Rights, or the 14th Amendment, or some of the, quite frankly, unenumerated rights that the Supreme Court has read into the Constitution, are important and in many, many cases worth celebrating. That being said, I also believe that especially elite law schools pay way too much attention to that portion of the Constitution that's litigated. That is, that becomes part of what I call in Framed, and I organize the book in some ways around two notions of the Constitution. One I call the Constitution of conversation. That is, the Constitution we talk about all the time. And why do we talk about it, especially if the we are people who teach or attend leading law schools either in the United States or elsewhere? What we tend to talk about is what is litigated. And what is litigated tends disproportionately to be the rights provisions of constitutions. It's also the case, quite frankly, if one teaches that it is extraordinarily easy to generate discussions of rights provisions. It's very easy to get people to talk to one another, and indeed to shout at one another about the one true meaning of freedom of speech, the free exercise clause, what equality means, what due process means. You can just march through the litany of rights. And if one looks at most post-World War II constitutions, where you have social rights on top of the individual rights that the United States Constitution tends to focus on, then we can argue all day about what it might mean to provide people with the right to medical care, the right to education, the right to a decent home, the right to a job, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So all of these are interesting and important, but I think, relatively speaking, we spend far, far more time than a balanced approach to the Constitution would merit. So what I have focused on in my recent writing, where recent now really means the last 10 years or so, and at least in some of my teaching, and I say some because, quite frankly, when I teach the introductory course at the University of Texas or at the Yale Law School, which I've done a couple of times, I have a certain responsibility to teach what the Supreme Court is doing, which is, by and large, or almost exclusively by definition, focusing on the Constitution of conversation. I try to work in to some introductory lectures the importance of what I call the Constitution of settlement, that is, the structural provisions of the Constitution that are never litigated and therefore never discussed. Before I turn to the Electoral College, which is the subject for today, let me give you a concrete example. I suspect that many of you, perhaps all of you, have been involved in conversations about the so-called counter-majoritarian difficulty posed by judicial review. That's certainly been an obsessive topic in American constitutional theory, at least since the 1960s, and the work of Alex Bickel. There is something significant about judicial review, and it's certainly worth talking about the legitimacy of judges in invalidating laws passed by a majority of both houses of Congress and signed by the president. That being said, I think it also merits discussion why a single individual called the President of the United States should have the right to render irrelevant the passage of a law by both houses of Congress by issuing a veto. And vetoes are usually upheld because it takes 2/3 of each house of Congress to override a veto. Vetoes are not always upheld. President Obama had a veto overwritten a couple of weeks ago with regard to a bill authorizing suit against so-called sovereign governments that are alleged to have participated in terrorist acts involving American citizens. But it's very, very rare. Of the roughly 2,500 or so vetoes over the course of our history, presidents have won 95% of the veto contest because it's hard to muster 2/3 majorities in both houses of Congress. It's also the case that the very threat to issue a veto makes the president in many ways a third house of the legislature in terms of the negotiation while crafting a bill. So it seems to me that in many significant ways we have a tricameral system, not merely a bicameral system, and that the presidential veto is wildly counter-majoritarian, far more counter-majoritarian than is judicial review, for a number of reasons we can get into during the question and answer period. But I would also argue that as a practical matter, presidential vetoes are more important than judicial review with regard to stymieing legislation that might very well serve the public good. And it has passed both houses of Congress, but a president says no. Undoubtedly, it's also the case that presidents have vetoed some terrible legislation. There'll be no doubt about that. So with any of these questions, it boils down to frequency distributions. Of all of the presidential vetoes, how many of them have truly served the national interest and how many of them have not? Same question as judicial review, quite frankly. But, as I say, law professors and their students almost invariably spend literally more than enough time talking about the counter-majoritarian difficulty in judicial review, and by and large spend no time talking about the presidential veto, because with one exotic exception, the so-called pocket veto, and if you want to know about it, ask me afterward, but let me assure you that it's not very important. With that exotic exception, there is no litigation on presidential vetoes, because all you have to do is to read the Constitution. It's not a question of interpretation, except in what I sometimes refer to as the highest of high theory seminars. But it's a pragmatic issue. There's nothing to interpret with regard to the veto system. There's a very important question as to the wisdom of the presidential veto, but quite frankly, law schools spend relatively little time talking about the wisdom of basic structural provisions in the Constitution, because that isn't what lawyers are really trained to think about. what we're trained to think about is how to interpret controversial or indeterminate parts of the Constitution, especially, as I've suggested, since World War II, rights provisions. So that's the second framing device for my talk, that it's really, really important to pay attention to structures. The third point has to do with the Electoral College itself. One of the candidates for the presidency is currently claiming that if he loses, it will be because the election is rigged. And that has led to an outpouring of antagonistic response that is predicated around the notion, how dare you suggest that the American electoral system is rigged? Indeed, it's the best in the world. So that Michelle Obama has given a speech, or gave a speech just yesterday, I think, in Arizona, where she told the audience, quote, "We are fortunate to live in a country where the voters decide our elections. The voters decide who wins and loses, period." End of story. She also suggested that people around the world admire the American democratic system and want to pattern themselves after it. What I want to argue is that for a variety of reasons, although I certainly share Ms. Obama's general political sentiments, and am not offering this as a brief for the Republican candidate, I do think it is important to look at the way that any constitution rigs the electoral system. If you use rigging as a metaphor, not necessarily or not exclusively for unfairness, but for establishing a basic structure, a rigging, if one thinks of an old-fashioned ship with masts, and it makes a difference how many masts there are and what sails are up and which are down. Rigging may quite literally be a matter of life and death. So that when one constructs an election system, one is making choices. And there is no such thing as a perfect election system, any more than there is a perfect political society. We've been arguing about basic political theory for 2,500 years, and nobody has come up with a dominant winning argument as to this particular framework of government being the uniquely best system that all rational people would adopt, that all electoral systems present their strengths and weaknesses. Just to take a very basic example, do you have first-past-the-post elections so that in order to win an election, all you have to do is beat everybody else? Or do you have a political system that is designed to create some semblance of majority support for the person who becomes president? The United States and the United Kingdom aren't uniquely addicted, but they're probably the two most important countries that remain fixated on first-past-the-post systems, whereas France, across the Channel, has a runoff system. So that whatever you might think of the current French president, the incumbent can make a plausible argument to have received the support of the majority of the French people. In the United States, put to one side the fact that George W. Bush got into office without even coming in first, and I will turn to that more concretely in just a moment or two. I'm more interested in many ways in the 1968 and 1992 presidential elections, where Richard Nixon and Bill Clinton got to the Oval Office with 43% of the vote. And there really is no way of telling who would have won a runoff between Richard Nixon and Hubert Humphrey. There was a third-party racist candidate, George Wallace, in '68, or in 1992, who would have won a runoff between Bill Clinton and George W. Bush, because Ross Perot, a billionaire from Texas, got 19% of the popular vote. And political scientists to this day can debate where Perot's votes would have gone. But the one thing we know is that there was no runoff, and the office went to somebody who had distinctly less than the majority of the vote. The most important example in American history of this is 1860 and Abraham Lincoln, who got to the Oval Office with 39.8% of the popular vote and a majority of the electoral vote. But his election triggered a war that killed 750,000 people. And one can say that the war was triggered by a fatal mixture of the issue of slavery, which might well have triggered a war sooner or later, but also the electoral system chosen in 1787 that makes electoral votes and not popular votes key. So that is why Ms. Obama, for all of my genuine admiration for her, is simply wrong when she says that in our country it is voters who decide elections. No, it is electors who decide elections. And there is a mixed relationship between popular votes and electoral votes. So why do we have this bizarre, basically unique and exceptional system whereby I sent in my absentee ballot yesterday to Texas? It says that I'm voting for a presidential candidate, but that's not true. I'm voting for the electors pledged to that presidential candidate. It's also the case, although right now people say that Texas is, quote, in play, unquote. I realized that in another book I recently wrote on the Federalists, I simply said that one of the things, and this was like 2015, one of the things I would happily predict is that whoever the candidate is, California will vote Democratic and Texas will vote Republican. Maybe that won't be true about Texas, though I'll still be, quite candidly in my case, happily surprised if that doesn't turn out to be true. But it also means that votes of Republicans in California basically don't count, or Democrats in Texas don't count, because all states but two adopt a winner-take-all system of allocating their electoral votes, so that all you have to do is come in first. Again, you don't have to get a majority. You have to come in first in order to get all the votes. So that George W. Bush in 2000 not only did not come in first in the national vote, he didn't get a majority of the Florida vote because there were a number of other candidates in the ballot as well. He got, I think, something like 48.8. It doesn't matter. It was less than 50. That's the important point. But it didn't matter. He got all of Florida's votes, courtesy of the United States Supreme Court. And having received all of Florida's votes, he therefore became president of the United States. So, why do we have this bizarre system? And why do we keep it? Those are two separate questions. Let me take what I hope will be about 5 minutes on each, and then break for questions. Why do we have it? Well, for better or worse, those who drafted the Constitution in 1787 chose a presidential form of government. Why? One answer is because really, in a very literal sense, they didn't know any better. Historians can look back and say that even by 1788, 1787, the United Kingdom was well on its way toward a parliamentary Westminster political regime. People didn't know that in 1787. His Majesty King George was a very powerful political figure, and what American colonists knew was a political system that included royal governors, and so it was quite natural to replace royal governors when they were signing state constitutions with elected governors, or when thinking about the national government, to think of a president rather than a parliamentary system that really wouldn't be on offer for constitutional drafters for another 50 or 100 years. You know, anybody drafting the Constitution after World War II is fully aware that there are alternatives to American presidentialism, which is one reason why most constitutional drafters in the modern era have rejected the American system of separation of powers and endless checks and balances in favor of one kind or another of a parliamentary system. Say that really wasn't on offer in 1787. Secondly, everybody knew that George Washington was to become president, and it would have been indelicate to really dwell on designing a system that might challenge his becoming our first leader. So having chosen a president, you have to figure out a way, well, how do you elect that person? There were a couple of people who said, well, let's have a popular election. But there were a number of problems with having a popular election. One of them is quite obvious and is a genuine problem. There's no way of denying that it's a genuine problem. That is, we did not have in 1788 a system of mass communications where ordinary people might have any informed knowledge about who might be best equipped to become president, any more than I won't say most people in this room, perhaps you're much more sophisticated than I am about international affairs in the United Nations. But let me tell you, I have no idea whatsoever who really should be the new Secretary General of the United Nations. I know that it's an important office. One might hope that it will become an even more important office in the future than it is now. And I have no idea who is best equipped to lead it. It makes sense that that choice ought to be made by people who are much more aware of international realities than I am. And I think it would be quite bizarre to say that there should be a worldwide election in which we all cast our ballot for Secretary General of the UN. So that argument was made, and I think quite plausibly, in 1787. There's also not merely a question about knowledge, but also a question about capacity. And the fact is that the people who designed the U.S. Constitution, as Mike Klarman in his new book emphasizes, I don't know if any of you were at his own talk this past Wednesday, where he describes the Philadelphia Convention as a coup, basically an anti-democratic coup. The people in Philadelphia were not radical Democrats. They really did not think that well of the capacity of ordinary people to engage in genuine self-governance. They wanted a political system that would be run by elites. But even if you weren't so elite-oriented, you might still say it doesn't make much sense to have people who really aren't aware of national politics, national leadership, national issues select a president, just as, I think very well of my own capacities, but I still don't think that I should have a say in who becomes Secretary General of the UN. So it would still make sense to say in 1787 that the decision should be made by others, and we will call them electors. So that ordinary, I say ordinary voters, but not even ordinary voters. The Constitution says nothing about voting for electors. It says the electors shall be chosen however state legislatures choose. And several state legislatures said, hey, we'll pick the electors. The last time that was done was by South Carolina in 1876. But you ought to know that two very eminent members of this law faculty argued in 2000 that the Florida legislature could in fact name the electors, given the irregularities in the Florida vote counting process. This possibility, at least at a theoretical level, remains alive and well. So that's one justification for the Electoral College, and I'm going to say makes sense. There are two other justifications that are much more ominous. One has to do with slavery. That is, the Electoral College assigns votes on the basis, it's the total of the number of representatives plus the 2 senators. Well, how do we decide how many representatives a state gets? The answer is, putting to one side some highly theoretical questions, the answer basically is, it's the number of people who live within the geographical area. Well, not all people are alike. And not all people, to put it mildly, are really welcome within the political community. But that may not matter. So that the original Constitution, when assigning the number of representatives in the House of Representatives, said the number is the total of all free people plus 3/5 of everybody else. That is, the slaves. There is no plausible theory, either then or now, that the slaves would be the recipients of virtual representation. That is, that those elected to the House would care about slaves. Whereas the arguments on justifying non-participation by women, we no longer accept them. But arguments were made by respectable people. 200 years ago, women didn't even have the vote because, after all, they have fathers, brothers, and husbands, and they would take care of women. Nobody argued plausibly that slaves would be taken care of by their masters as a political matter, but rather the slave-owning states got extra representation. They got extra representation not only in the House, but also in the Electoral College. And this helps to explain why 7 of the first 9 presidents were slave owners, and why the Supreme Court, until the Civil War, was dominated by slave-friendly justices, because it really was very important to be responsive to slave state interests, because they had such power, not only in the House, but also in choosing the president. If you had had a popular election, you lose that power instantly, because people who can't vote have no power. And if you're a state in which most people don't vote, then you have far, far less power than you might have relative to other states that have more voters. But if you assign electoral votes by total people, whether or not they can vote, then this is manna from heaven with regard to political elites within a given state who want to transfer their power to the national stage. So that brings up a third function of the Electoral College, whether or not it was a conscious purpose. That is to say, there's no incentive for states to maximize the turnout of their citizens. The incentive is to maximize the turnout of your political friends and to suppress the vote of your political enemies. And lo and behold, this is exactly what you see in a number of states these days, including Texas, North Carolina, where I'm originally from, and other states where, thanks to the United States Supreme Court and its gutting of the Voting Rights Act in a 2013 decision called Shelby County, what you see, quite frankly, and I could cite Richard Posner, the most interesting of all federal judges, who is correctly thought to be very conservative, but Richard Posner himself said that it is almost exclusively Republican states who are trying to structure the state election systems in order to suppress the turnout of Democrats. And they have no incentive not to do that, and every incentive to try to limit the electorate. What would be perfect, of course, if there were no election at all, and the governor of a given state could simply pick the winner of a state's electoral votes. So we do have elections. Michelle Obama is correct. There are elections, and the votes are somewhat important, but they're not so important as she thinks they are. And that is, to put it mildly, worth discussing. So let me conclude very briefly. So why do we continue to have this crazy system to elect presidents, given that the original rationales no longer hold? We have not only national media and social media, we also have political parties, rightly or wrongly, and for good or for ill. And one of the things that political parties do is coordinate. A political party that is functioning well will be able to identify people who are plausible candidates to be president of the United States. One could say that one of the political parties overwhelmingly failed that test this year. But fortunately, that's not a common practice. Generally, political parties have chosen candidates who would make plausible presidents, whether you support them or not. And can also organize campaigns. So the argument that the people just have no idea who the national elites might be or what their positions on issues might be, that no longer makes any sense. There obviously is no longer any reason to bend over backwards to be friendly to slave states. And thirdly, there's no good reason to stick with a political system that creates a perverse incentive to limit the turnout of your political opponents in ways that could really matter. If we had a national election, there still might be an incentive to limit the turnout of your political opponents, but it would be less important, frankly. Take a state like Alaska, which has an electorate of about 100,000 people, maybe 150,000 people. If you can successfully keep 20 or 30,000 people away, maybe even 2,000 or 3,000 people away from the polls, that might tilt the balance. And that might mean that your candidate got those 3 electoral votes. And we know in 2000, that even 3 electoral votes can be the difference between success or failure. So there's a high incentive at the state level. If you're talking about a national electorate of, and I'm making the number up, 150 million voters, if you manage to suppress the vote of 20 or 30,000 people, that's a bad thing. But quite frankly, it is not likely to tilt the national balance. So the Electoral College magnifies the potential importance of limiting or suppressing the electorate. So why do we have it? Every public opinion poll taken since 1944 indicates majority disapproval of Americans of the Electoral College. More constitutional amendments have been introduced to get rid of the Electoral College than any other single topic. But we still got it. Well, why? One answer comes back to the importance of structures. Another thing that is exceptional about the United States Constitution, and the thing that I most dislike or even detest about the U.S. Constitution, is that we have the hardest Constitution to amend of any national constitution in the world. Article 5 creates almost insurmountable hurdles for constitutional amendments. You have to get 2/3 of each House of Congress and then 3/4 of the states, or there is an alternative path. If 2/3 of the states petition for a convention, Congress in theory is obliged to call one, but we've never had one. It's been only the congressional track. And if you think seriously about constitutional amendment, and I do, because I don't like the U.S. Constitution and very much wish it were amended in a number of ways. But if you do take this seriously, you're well advised to think of Dante and abandon all hope, ye who enter here, because it is so immensely difficult to amend the Constitution. It really doesn't matter that most Americans don't like the Electoral College. That's irrelevant with regard to explaining why we still have it. But there have been votes in Congress on whether to amend the Electoral College or not. You need 2/3 in each house. Why hasn't it gotten 2/3? Why hasn't it even gotten out of Congress? Well, ironically enough, on some occasions, the small states have said, hey, we like this system. We in Alaska or Vermont or Wyoming think it's just terrific that we get a guaranteed 3 votes and can play a more important role in the election than would be the case if we had a national election, single national popular vote election. And you can show that small states do benefit, not hugely, but do benefit from the Electoral College. George W. Bush was elected president because he got the 9 electoral votes of North Dakota, South Dakota, and Wyoming, which together have roughly the same population as New Mexico, which voted for Al Gore. But New Mexico has only 5 electoral votes. 9 beats 5 anytime. And so it's a very dramatic illustration of the boost given to small states. And if you need 3/4 of the states to agree, you would have to limit the small states who want to keep their advantage in the Electoral College to 12. Because if it reaches 13, there's no amendment. But it's also the case that on occasion, it's large states who say, let's keep the Electoral College, it's good for us. And there are 2 different arguments. One is because they can aggregate, because it's winner take all, because the Democrats right now have a lock on 56 electoral votes in California. I think it's 56, which is roughly 20% of what it takes to elect the president. Why would a state want to give that up? Why would it want to say, well, we'll still have power because there are 38 million people and let's say 20 million voters in California, but we'd rather have the power that comes from aggregating the 56 votes. So Texas, similarly, with I think 36 electoral votes. So that's one problem, kind of a general problem of whether large states don't see themselves as advantaged. The really large states, not the middle states, like North Carolina, say where I'm from, which I think has 15 electoral votes or so. But the really large states see themselves advantaged. And no large states see themselves more advantaged than so-called battleground states. Think of Florida, think of Ohio. You discover that presidential candidates never spend time in California or Texas. Maybe they are now, actually, literally this week, because of recent polls showing that Texas is in play. But let me tell you, as somebody who splits his time between Massachusetts and Texas, we have no knowledge that there are presidential contests, except in Massachusetts, because we're part of the New Hampshire market. And New Hampshire is now a so-called battleground state. And so battleground states, like their status, the candidates visit them, they pander to them. And so why would New Hampshire want to give this up? Not only because New Hampshire is a small state and gets whatever small state benefit there is, but also, at least currently, they're getting the benefit of being a battleground state, and that would simply vanish overnight if you moved to a popular vote process. But in any event, this is why we have and keep a bizarre, basically unique system of electing presidents that can have extremely important consequences, not only for the United States, but for the entire world, given that for better and for worse, the American president is, if not the most powerful person in the world, then certainly a candidate for the top 3 or 4 powerful people in the world. And one might wish that that person, assuming you want to stick with the presidential system at all, that that person were elected by a more defensible system than the system foisted on the United States in 1787. Let me stop there, and I will be delighted to take any questions or comments.